All right, welcome to the Mighty Things podcast, episode 2, and we are going to be talking about Lewis and Clark today. Yeah, I'm really excited about this one. This is a great story, and we've been reading about it and prepping for the last couple weeks, so just excited to discuss this today. So before we get into it, our mission at Mighty Things is to help families get outside, off of screens, exploring the world together, learning, building things. And part of what we're trying to do with this podcast is just share inspirational stories of people who have accomplished incredible things. So our first episode was covering the life of Theodore Roosevelt. And today we're back for the Lewis and Clark expedition here. But yeah, maybe we start and just give a quick overview on what that is, just in case somebody has no idea. We'll start with like a high-level overview before we go into the details. Yeah, that sounds really good. And just to tie it to our last episode, Teddy Roosevelt actually does reference the Lewis and Clark journals and expedition, and so we're kind of going back in time from our first episode. Basically, think American Revolution, about 30 years after. Thomas Jefferson is president. And we're going to hear about this, but it's the time of the Louisiana Purchase. So we've just bought a big chunk of the United States, and Jefferson wants to send out a military expedition to figure out what's out there. This was basically unknown territory. Anything west of St. Louis, Missouri was pretty much unknown. They had no idea what the Rocky Mountains looked like. They had no idea what kind of animals or even Indian tribes were out there. And so it was like this massive attempt to like put it on the map or build a map. Right, exactly. They had going, like you said, to St. Louis, they had some information. The fur trade was going on during this time, so they did have information from kind of the most forward frontiersmen that went out. And then they had some information about the Pacific side, like the Columbia River opening, because of some of the voyages that had gone there, but they didn't really know what it was like between. A key reason for the expedition, I think, was to see could they actually navigate all the way to the Pacific Ocean following rivers. One of the things they accomplished is traveling 8,000 miles with a party of 33 people. And so some of those were soldiers. They had some hired translators. They had Sacagawea that we'll hear about, as well as her infant this entire time. Yeah. And just for perspective, the Appalachian Trail is 2,000 miles. So that's a long way. Now, they didn't walk the whole way. They took the river on part of it, but it's a very long way to go. So it takes them 2 years, 4 months, and 9 days in the wilderness. And just to give some perspective on that, that is out there completely separated from civilization. Whatever they had with them is all that they had to survive, except what they were able to find from the Indian tribes they interact with, that they had no idea if those Indians would be hostile or not. But the cool thing is, this was not just like guys trying to make it across country. It was a scientific expedition. And a big part of what they did is documenting pretty much everything that they found, like incredible documentation. Right. Yeah. They documented 178 new plant species, 122 new animals previously unknown to science. They also interacted with dozens of Indian tribes that really hadn't interacted with the white man before. So it was definitely a lot of groundbreaking work. We won't spoiler alert for the end, but interestingly, some of the new species they named, actually the names that they gave them didn't stick. So we'll talk about why that was. But they were the first people to kind of, or the first, white men to kind of analyze and scientifically observe some of these things. So the output of this whole thing was basically opening the American West to settlers who would come after. And the legacy, as David just alluded to, is kind of shrouded in mystery and a bit of tragedy, which we'll get to. But yeah, needless to say, this is an amazing story. Now, we are not just making all of this up. We both read this book here. Yes. Undaunted Courage by Stephen E. Ambrose. Recommend it. Just a few caveats here, or disclaimers. Not necessarily everything in here is appropriate for children. It is an accurate historic record, and not everything that happened is necessarily for young ears. But it is a very interesting story. Now, we also want to say we're not necessarily endorsing everything these men did in their lives. I think there's clearly some troubling aspects, specifically slavery. But what we are pointing to is that they exhibited some really extreme courage on this journey, and specifically for Lewis and Clark, they showed some amazing leadership of their team that they had with them. And so those are the things that we are focused on today. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess we're hoping this is an inspiring story to anyone who's listening, just who's looking for a great history and, I'm not saying necessarily role models, but great examples of people that did really courageous, challenging things, had a tremendous amount of, independence, resilience, and capability. It's really, amazing to compare. Like, you kind of put yourself during that time in their shoes, and it's like, wow, they were really, really capable to be able to undertake this expedition. Like the level of difficulty, you just don't hear about people today going through this type of an expedition or exploration, and doing it with very little. And the thing is, they chose this. Lewis and Clark were both wealthy, from wealthy families. They could have just hung out on their plantations and had a nice life, and they chose to do this despite that. And so that is, again, one of the reasons we're highlighting them. So yeah, let's kind of move from this big picture now into some of the specifics. We'll talk a little bit about Lewis specifically. So Meriwether Lewis is the one who is more or less the main leader of the expedition. So the book we read starts with his early life, and then we get to the expedition. We're going to spend just a few minutes talking about his early life because it gives context. Then we'll talk about the expedition specifically. We'll go through some of the details. The purpose of this podcast is not to go into every single thing that happened. If you want that, read the book. Right. We're more talking about things we learned, things we found interesting, specific stories, that kind of thing. After that, we're going to go into kind of maybe what some takeaways are, some things that you could apply, or even discuss some interesting aspects of the expedition. So yeah, why don't we just talk about, like I said, early years and what led up to this expedition. So Meriwether Lewis, that is the Lewis in the Lewis and Clark. Right. He was born in Virginia, very near Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. If you've ever been there, still a very famous landmark you can visit. And this is right before the Revolution, 1774. And he's born into, as we've already mentioned, somewhat of the aristocracy there on a plantation, very quickly moving through his early life here. His dad dies young. His mom remarries. He ends up on the Georgia frontier as he's growing up through like the age of 10. Just a couple of stories that really stood out to me here. He, at a very young age, was already becoming a capable hunter. As they were down there on the Georgia frontier, he would go out, and Thomas Jefferson actually wrote about him as an 8-year-old going out and hunting at night, which is pretty crazy. Yeah, in the context of expectations of what that we have today. Yeah, I have a 7-year-old, so I was just imagining like, hey, here's a gun, go hunt raccoons at night. Like that's not gonna happen. In the snow. That's right. One other story that really stood out to me is there was an Indian scare at one point, and the families in this area all got together in the woods, and they were like fortifying the area they're in because they're expecting to be attacked. And something went down, a gunshot rang out, everybody starts to panic, and Lewis, who was like younger than 10, I think, or around there, he was very young, was the one to think to put out the fire. He immediately went and put out the fire. So I think there's two interesting things that come from this. The first is, all the crazy capabilities that we talk about later didn't come from nowhere. He started at a very young age, learning the rigor and discipline and capabilities to do all these things. The other thing is he was exposed to danger at a very young age. And that's something that, we don't necessarily want our kids to be exposed to danger if we can help it, but it's also like we don't want to shelter them from things that will prepare them for life. And I think that's one of the things that stood out to me is like he was prepared for what he ended up facing later. He developed these skills that he definitely needs and depends on at an early age. He, like you said, he spent time on the frontier, and so he would have known like hunting and fishing and probably some trapping skills and just what it was like to live in the wilderness. So that was hugely important. He ends up back in Virginia as he's getting older. He gets some education from tutors, which is the way it was done then. And then this thing happens called the Whiskey Rebellion. George Washington is president, so this is right after the Constitution. And essentially what happens is Alexander Hamilton pushes through a tax on whiskey and other products. But to the Westerners, think like Western Pennsylvania, which was the West at the time, they would take their wheat and the things they grew and turn it into whiskey because whiskey was more valuable and easier to transport to the East. And so for them, it's like all these Easterners are taxing us, which, hey, we just had a revolution because we didn't like this kind of taxation. And there was a rebellion. And so George Washington raises an army. And this is where Lewis joins. Basically, he joins as a private to take part in that campaign. He, I guess, was promoted at a certain point, right, to a lieutenant and then to a captain in the military. And then he was stationed at some frontier posts as well. So he's getting that military kind of frontier experience. He also meets Clark during this time. So Clark is the other big player in the expedition, and we'll hear more about him in a second. But Clark was actually a little bit older, and they served together at one of those outposts and became really good friends, apparently, for the time that they were together, because we're going to hear about them coming back together here very shortly. So then essentially what happens is Thomas Jefferson becomes president, and he knows Lewis very well because Lewis grew up very close to where Thomas Jefferson had Monticello, and he invites Lewis to be his personal secretary and allows him to keep his military rank. but brings him to the White House. And for the next few years, Lewis lives in the White House, handling a lot of the correspondence and details of the Thomas Jefferson administration. This was an interesting part of the story to me because he spends a lot of time with Thomas Jefferson. I think definitely built a relationship with him. And Jefferson was like, I guess, the Renaissance sort of Enlightenment man. You know, he has all these different interests, and probably, I think he's described as being a fascinating person to talk to, very well read, very well educated. And so this would have been like a really amazing opportunity for Lewis to be able to spend all this time with Thomas Jefferson. And that, I guess, kind of segues into the maybe the genesis of the idea of the expedition. So we could probably go there next. So as you mentioned, they're spending a lot of time together, and one of Jefferson's passions is spreading democracy, essentially, to use a modern term, across the continent. It's one of his visionary things that he always envisioned sea to sea of the United States and what that represented. And as you mentioned, like, he was a visionary of a vision. So, like, you know, he was writing about flying machines, and he invented various things that were used, like a plow. Like, Thomas Jefferson was a crazy smart, also very complicated person, but we can come back for that another time. But one of the things he wanted was to spread essentially the values of the United States from sea to sea. And that had been something for decades, actually. But as president, he finally has the power to do it. And he starts plotting pretty much immediately with Lewis on how they're going to go about doing that. I guess the other thing that stood out to me about Jefferson is, you know, Jefferson is interested. This is not like a commercial conquest venture for him. Like, he's very interested in the geology, the geography, you know, the scientific observations, like ethnography, the botany, all those aspects, just wanting to learn everything he can about those areas. And so you can see that as the expedition comes together, that's kind of a foundational thing, is this is a scientific exploration. It's not just a conquest that's an interesting point, because Thomas Jefferson was very much not an imperialist. He was, as you're saying, more of an Enlightenment, Renaissance sort of person. I guess Enlightenment is more accurate, but it's like super interested into knowledge, discovering things that aren't known. And yeah, absolutely. And at this time, the United States is basically the East Coast up into St. Louis. So that is the United States. Those are the colonies that have broken away and become the United States. To the west of that, so states like today, Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, all of that was actually Spanish territory. You also had some claimed British territory out there, some French territories. It was very complicated, but another concern that Jefferson had was, you know, removing European powers who were actively a threat to the United States at the time. Should we talk about the Louisiana Purchase here? Because that's kind of a big piece that's happening. Or is that maybe that's a little further along? No, I think so. So initially, Lewis and Jefferson are talking about this adventure, and it's a secret because they're talking about going through enemy territory, essentially. So they're going to go through Spanish territory, potentially British territory, French territory. Keep in mind, this is the era of Napoleon. So the so-called Spanish territory is actually Napoleon's territory because his brother is the king of Spain. So, like, all of that, very, very complicated, but it's like, and so they get secret funding from Congress, actually, to send out this expedition. But then, as you mentioned, the idea of the Louisiana Purchase comes up. And what's going on here is Napoleon ends up taking over all that Spanish territory, and he needs money. He realizes they can't hold on to it as a French colony. They had a colony in Haiti, and they lost it. They spent a whole bunch of money and blood trying to get it back, and they couldn't. So he knew they were going to lose it, and he was like, okay, I'm going to get money out of this. And Thomas Jefferson went in thinking that they were going to negotiate for what we know of today as Louisiana, as in down on the coast. I guess specifically New Orleans, just because it was basically a trade hub where ships would go in and out. So it's very important to the trade to have control of that port. That's right, because in the United States, the Mississippi and Ohio rivers went down to the Gulf of Mexico, and that's where all the farmers would send their produce. So owning that port there in New Orleans was super, super critical to the United States. And so Thomas Jefferson goes in to negotiate that, or rather his men, and we end up long story short, buying the Louisiana Purchase, which doubles the size of the United States overnight. And one of the really interesting things here is this is like antithetical to what Thomas Jefferson believed in. He viewed the presidency as extremely limited. He believed that it could only do things that are explicitly outlined in the Constitution. And nowhere in the Constitution does it give the president the right to grab territory. But essentially, it was such a good deal that he was like, okay, principles out the door. We're buying this thing. Yeah. So I thought that was really interesting.
That was really interesting. Yeah, and I think there's more we can talk about here. I have to go quick, but I think Napoleon felt like he was setting up the U.S. as being a counter to England. So he was like, yeah, I'll sell to this new empire because it will kind of counterbalance them in this area. So there was a little bit of strategy there. He was okay, I guess, with the U.S. being the one that was purchasing it. But, this is the land deal of, I don't know, of the millennium. I don't know, like the incredible price deal that we got for that mass amount of territory. So that was coincidentally going on. It was like, on the stars aligning, right? We got that territory. So none of the Indian tribes or anyone, a lot of them would not have known that. And so this expedition was also carrying the news that like, hey, the United States now owns this territory. So that was, breaking news.
Which to them was probably like, what are you even talking about? Yeah, just a few stats here on the purchase. So the Louisiana Purchase, 1803, was for 828,000 square miles for $15 million. That's 3 cents per acre. It doubled the size of the United States overnight and is considered one of the best real estate deals ever done. So there you go, Trump.
Yeah, that's just insane. I guess the other thing too is Thomas Jefferson is training Lewis, on like all the things he knows about botany and mineralogy, and then like scientific observations, like taking measurements from the stars to calculate your position. Like they're just out on the lawn, taking these observations. It's like this intense crash course because he knows they're going to do this, and he wants Lewis to know as much as possible. I think we kind of skipped over this, but Thomas Jefferson, I think, felt like Lewis for this expedition, which he'd been plotting, felt like he was the ideal candidate for it because, I mean, he was personal connection, but Lewis has like the frontier background, military background. He's reasonably educated. He's not like super well educated, but he can read and write. The combination of the three things, or the multiple things, make him the candidate over strictly a scientist or strictly a military person or strictly a frontier. It's that blend of things that makes him the perfect person.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, so over a 2-year period here, Lewis is working incredibly hard learning all this stuff from Jefferson specifically, as well as the scientific elite in Philadelphia. And so he meets with Benjamin Rush, who's a famous doctor, I guess. There were botanists, there were folks who were into astronomy, all of that. And he's essentially going through like a master's degree in all this stuff, cramming to learn what he needs to know in order to lead the expedition. And now that they have money from Congress, he's also buying tons of supplies. We're not going to go into it, but like the supplies that he had to buy, like incredible, the amount of planning.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We can't go into details, but Lewis is basically the planning guy. Now, he does consult a ton of people, but he is the one who's doing the planning. And a lot of it is speculation, right? Because so they know what they're trying to do. They know they're going to be unaided, but I think the plan seems like it balloons, like the amount of things they want. It keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And, they're like, how many guns do we need? How much gunpowder? How much food? What kinds of, vessels do we need to carry us up the river? And so, yeah, there's a huge amount of planning before they're able to set off.
One of the big debates they had were, how many people do we need on this expedition? And it was like, we have a few people, we move fast, but the Indians will kill us all. We need enough people that the Indians will take us seriously, but we can still move. And they end up on, I think it was like 30 to 40 was the range that Lewis was starting to buy supplies for. And that also trickles down to like, okay, how many guns, how many boats, how much food, all of that kind of stuff. So very intense couple of years there, as well as a lot of innovation. So Lewis designed a boat that could fold up. It was a steel frame boat. Another really interesting thing is he had gunpowder packed in lead cases, where the lead cases could be melted down into bullets. And it was the exact number of bullets to go with the amount of gunpowder in the cases. So they were trying to be extremely efficient. And what's interesting is on the expedition, they end up running out of a lot of things that are nice to have, I guess, to them, like whiskey, the comforts, I guess.
they did not run out of any essentials. When they got back, they had enough gunpowder to repeat the expedition, and that was like the gunpowder and rifles kept them alive. So it was like stuff like
that was basically the number one tool was the weapons.
That's right.
Hunting and protection.
Yeah. That's right. So we can probably fast forward a little bit here. Again, a lot goes into this. Lewis gets a boat built, and I think just giving a sense for scale here, these guys were not in little canoes. You had a party of 30 to 40 people. They had a very large boat. We'll show some images of
keel boat.
Keel boat, that's right. As well as what they were calling pirogues, which again were not small vessels. These are big vessels, and this is a military expedition. So Thomas Jefferson, as the commander-in-chief, is writing specific military orders on what he wants done, which is a very formal thing. And Lewis, as a captain in the military, is accepting those orders and therefore executing them. And so he forms what's called the Corps of Discovery. And that's this specific military unit of folks they recruit to take with them. And one of the folks that he recruits right away is Clark.
Yeah.
So Clark, again, they had served together before. Apparently they were great friends. And Lewis wants to be essentially co-commanders with him.
Which I think was very unusual because you can imagine like 50-50, it's not going to go well. But they actually worked really well together. He seemed like he had like total confidence in Clark from whatever his background was with him. So definitely there was a huge amount of just camaraderie and sharing the co-captaincy or co-command. And then they did, I do remember them saying they were looking for, I think mostly young men that were unattached. Like they didn't have wives and children. They were basically ready for a hard time, were physically capable. And then I think, so they interviewed a lot of people for this, but I think they were looking for people that had skills as well that would be useful to them. So one of the guys was very good, like blacksmith, like for repairing like metal tools and weapons. I'm guessing like if you were really a good hunter or you're a good trapper or you were good at, I don't know, like all the different things that you needed to do out in the frontier. They were looking for people with those sorts of skills as well. I guess we could probably fast forward to maybe like kicking off.
So if you are listening, we will start putting visuals on the screen. So switch over to YouTube. You'll get the visuals. We have a map here, and they are in St. Louis. It is May 14th, 1804. St. Louis is the very far reaches of the known universe, effectively. This is a city of about 1,000 people, mostly French Canadians, but it's now part of the United States. And this is where they finish their preparations. They winter there, and then in May, they're now ready to take off. They load up into their boats, and one of the orders that Jefferson had given them is he wants to find a water route across the country. So they're not just walking, which frankly probably would have been easier, but they are going to go upstream the Missouri River in order to see if they can take rivers all the way across the continent, essentially. As they head out, so May 25th, they pass actually a settlement that had Daniel Boone in it, and that was the very farthest settled point. So it gets smaller and smaller, these little villages they're going through. St. Louis is the last city. They go past Daniel Boone.
If they had actually met him, that would have been epic. But
yeah, apparently it's not known.
Yeah,
he was there, but it's not known if they met him or not. So yeah, now they are going upstream with these massive boats, which sounds like an incredible amount of work. If you've ever gone kayaking, going downstream is really easy. You just sit back. Going upstream is really hard. So they are making like 10 to 15 miles per day. That's it. And so their route is they cut straight across Missouri to present-day Kansas City, and then the river starts to go north from there. If you look at a map, the Missouri River forms the edge of a lot of states. So it forms part of the edge of Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa. So it's like right up through there that they're going, as you mentioned, trying to make it to North Dakota before winter.
And the other thing is, this is the point where they're meeting Indians now, right? They're going to Indian territory, and these Indians would have traded a whole lot with, St. Louis. Like they're pretty close to trading outposts and that kind of thing. But he was telling them, I think it was your new father, Jefferson. you have a new father, is what he was telling the Indians. So he's announcing the Louisiana Purchase, and one of his goals, I think, was to make as much peace with and good relations with the tribes because they want to open up trade. So he's got multiple goals going on. Like there's the expedition, obviously the scientific aspect, but I think he's also trying to kind of pave the way for commerce as well and trade.
Right. That's one of his objectives. He's also trying to get chiefs to go to Washington, D.C. to visit Jefferson, which was really interesting.
Yeah.
And you can kind of think there are dozens and dozens of tribes out there that are all essentially very different nations. As we'll hear, a lot of them had different cultures, and they were perpetually at war with each other and everybody else around. So I think, we're not going to get into Indian affairs very much. I think there were a lot of injustices on both sides for sure. But the idea that the Indians were just at peace with the buffaloes out there is not true at all.
Yeah.
A lot of these tribes were on the border of starvation. A lot of them were at war constantly with each other. We're going to hear about slavery between Indians, all of this stuff. It's pretty rough. And so, yeah, part of what Lewis is trying to do is bring peace to the tribes for the sake of trade.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess a quick note on that would be I did think it was funny how he went about that. So he's trying to get them to, like, some of these tribes to stop warring with each other as they go along. And I don't know, the way he's doing that, it seems almost very much in like a treaty sort of a way, like, hey, let's just agree and like have a formal agreement. And that's not how they do it out there. There's not formal agreements. So he just seems like he's approaching this in, I don't know, like a way that's not going to work.
It felt very naive,
Yeah,
I think.
exactly.
And maybe
Yeah,
he was
that's
executing his orders, but it's like the speech he was giving. It's like if they, so also they had to translate, right? And so they would translate from English to French to whatever Indian language, sometimes from Indian language to Indian language. So
the ultimate game of telephone.
their translation chains could be 5 languages sometimes. And we'll hear about their translators in a little bit. And through that, he's trying to, deliver these complicated messages about, things that the Indians had, they couldn't have cared less about. It seemed really borderline arrogant and also just very naive, I think.
Yeah, it did seem kind of naive. The Indians also, what I thought was interesting is because of trade, a lot of the tribes were getting weapons, right, and tools and things like that. And it was definitely a situation where if you were a tribe that didn't get that, then you were all of a sudden, it was a disadvantage because you'd be driven away. So the Indians actually had to start adopting Western weapons. Otherwise, they were going to be driven off by their competitors.
By their own tribe,
Right.
by other Indian tribes, yeah. Right.
Exactly. So the Indians were very interested in trade to actually survive. So it's like everyone's starting to get involved in this trade, and they have to survive. And so they want guns and whiskey and that kind of thing, which are the things that the expedition is not willing to give them. So the expedition is like, hey, here's some beads and like some flags and things like that. And the Indians are like, that's really nice, but we want guns and that kind of thing. So that was a recurring theme.
And this actually causes quite a bit of drama. So South Dakota, now September, so they've been on the road for like, 6 months or something at this point. And this is one of the most, I guess, potentially dangerous situations. Some warriors of this tribe that they're going through here basically grab the ropes holding their boats and are not letting them leave. And they're like, hey, exactly what you said. We want guns and whiskey. Those are the things they wanted. And they're trying to get a bribe basically to allow the group to go on. And there's hundreds of warriors. And it gets so hostile that basically they draw their weapons on both sides. Clark has his sword out. Lewis grabs one of the swivel guns mounted on the boat, which is essentially a shotgun. And there's a really tense standoff there. And it almost comes to blows. Thankfully, it didn't, because the Lewis and Clark expedition probably would have been eliminated.
Oh, yeah, they would have been done. Yeah, way outnumbered.
Thankfully, they're able to bluff their way out of it and proceed on their way. But that was the first sign that, like, yeah, this could be rough, because they had no idea what they would meet going ahead. So yeah, let's skip ahead then to the Mandan villages. So they make it to North Dakota. Very interestingly, this is close to where Teddy Roosevelt was. And they get to this massive village called the Mandan Village. And apparently this is one of the biggest Indian settlements. There were over 4,000 people here. And it was a very, I guess, positive relationship. These were all trading posts. So the French and the British had been trading here for years. And this is where Lewis and Clark decide to winter from 1804 to 1805. So they arrive in October, and they're there all the way until April, until they're able to keep going again. But yeah, a couple of important meetings take place here after they build a fort, basically, that they live in.
Yeah, so they hire a French-Canadian trader, Charbonneau. So I think the main reason they hire him was his 16-year-old Shoshone wife, Sacagawea, one of the most famous people in the expedition. So she had been kidnapped and sold to him 5 years earlier. I don't know a lot of backstory here, but they knew that she would be very important for, I guess, communicating with the tribes because she was from further west. So they basically hired him because of her connections.
That's right. So when they were here for this whole winter, so several months, they were basically interrogating Indians, like in a nice way, but like trying to figure out what's ahead, because this is the last point of any civilized person known to have gone in the Louisiana Purchase area. So they would talk to multiple Indians trying to make a map and then compare stories. And when the stories aligned, they would add things to their maps. It was a really interesting process. So they knew some of the tribes they were going to be going through, and some of those were the Shoshone Indians. So they knew that they would need to barter with the Shoshones. And the Shoshone Indian available was Sacagawea, because she had been kidnapped by these Mandan Indians, again, the warring tribes here. And she was essentially sold as a slave slash wife to this guy. And so they're like, okay, you're all coming with us. Another interesting factor, Sacagawea gives birth during this winter. And Lewis, who had like done his crash course in medical treatments of the time, ends up helping because it's a pretty rough labor. But the important detail here is they end up taking that infant on the rest of the journey here. And he goes from basically infancy to, I believe, like 2 years old on this journey.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how that worked out, but it's pretty amazing.
The Indians, one of the things that stood out to me was the Indians, some of them were, I mean, they had to be like as tough as nails and also very conditioned to living in extreme conditions. There was a story, I think, in there about they had met some of the Indians and, they're in like minus 30 Fahrenheit temperatures and things like that. And the Indians are, they're sleeping out on the ground, like underneath a buffalo blanket or something. And that's basically it. And they have very thin clothes and they're fine.
The other note there that I think taking Sacagawea and her infant probably kept the expedition alive in a couple of ways. One of them is whenever they would meet warriors going forward, it would be like, okay, this party probably is not here to make war because they've got a lady and her child. Even in the Indian culture, that's like extremely unusual for those to be traveling. And so I think that was noted that helped. And then also Sacagawea had a lot of knowledge of like the plants and animals that were edible. And that comes to play later when the expedition runs out of food a couple of times. So it's now 1805 and they leave North Dakota. They're now headed into Montana, still paddling their way up the Missouri River here. And okay, so we're getting into bear country, which is kind of fun. So at the Mandan villages, the Indians had told them about grizzly bears, and they were like, they didn't believe it. Yeah. Basically, the stories that they would hear, they're like, okay, these guys are all making this up. And then they get out there, and the first grizzly bear they meet, they shoot it 10 times, and it still chases them. And there are some really crazy stories here about they couldn't kill these things. And yeah, Lewis thought like, oh, we've got rifles, we'll be fine. The Indians just don't have rifles. And they get out there, they can't kill these things. They shoot them multiple times and they still get chased. And like there are guys jumping into rivers to try to get away from them. Yeah, really crazy stories.
You've got, I mean, the rifles at the time are what, like single shot, you're muzzle loading them, or, well, I don't know if they actually breech loaded them.
No, it would have been muzzle loaded. They were rifles, so it wasn't a musket. It was a rifle, but they were still muzzle loaded.
You shoot and it takes you probably a minute or something like that.
That's right.
Load it. So, you might have a couple of them on you, but yeah, there's some guys that were, there was a bear chasing one of them, and I think he just like jumped into the river to try to escape after he had fired.
The other thing that's happening is Lewis and Clark, as the boats are being either pushed or pulled oftentimes up these rivers, they're out walking along the banks, taking all their scientific observations. So every time there is a tributary off the river, which is like a stream that comes in, they're taking their astronomical observations, they're drawing maps, they're observing plants and animals, taking samples. Sounds like a really fun job, actually. And Lewis apparently was especially gifted at this and probably helped his crash course in botany and all of that. But they were writing journals this entire time, and we're going to keep bringing up the journals because it's a big part of it. But they made some incredible documentation.
Yeah, the journals are probably the most valuable thing, obviously, they took back was the journals. The journals were jam-packed with just detailed, like, day-by-day observations of what they were doing. Multiple men kept journals. Lewis and Clark basically told several of the men, like, hey, keep journals so that we'll have records. But then they themselves kept journals as well. So they would write down, everything that happened each day. And it was in high levels of detail. Like they would do the like observe things. There's little sketches in some of the journals to show you like plants and animals that they observed. And then the celestial observations, I found that kind of fascinating. So they're using, they're citing stars and that kind of thing. And they're
calculating latitude and longitude was very difficult using these observations. And in a lot of cases, they actually wrote the calculations down, but actually saved the calculating for back when they got, got back when they're finished. They would just give it to a scientist and have him, or a mathematician, have him finish the calculation. So they have, journals of like pages and pages of like, logs, and they're hoping to be able to pinpoint those on the map. So
one thing that kind of came to mind when I was reading all of this is some of the things they didn't know were pretty crazy, right? They would still bleed people when they got sick, and it's like they didn't understand bacteria, and it's like, oh, they just didn't know so much. But on the other hand, it's like they knew so much about how to stay alive and how to do these things that we take for granted today. It's like we want to eat, so we go to the grocery store and we buy bread and we buy meat. They were out there, and every day they had to figure out, what are we going to eat? They have to go hunt it, which is a skill. That's not easy. They have to kill the food. They have to prepare the food. They have to cook the food. They have to, basically stay alive, know where they are, do maps, do these scientific, like they had such an incredible level of knowledge of things that were so practical that we just take for granted today. That really just struck me, that it's like easy to look back and be like, well, they just didn't know anything. But it's like these guys probably knew more about day-to-day life than like most of us today.
Yeah, it's kind of like layers of abstraction. Like we're definitely like way abstract. Like, so for example, if you want to know where you are, obviously you pull your phone out and it's like, oh, there's where we are on the map. But like that was very difficult to determine at that time. And they needed to, they're making a map. So they were trying to figure out like, where exactly is this? But yeah, exactly. They were like much more capable without like the modern technology. They could do all this. And then the power of observation too. I mean, I feel like, I'm not trying to generalize things, but a lot of people are like, there's a tree, like there's a bird, and they're specific species of trees and birds, and like high level of attention to detail. They understand these things, and he's even saying, like, there's sometimes when he says like the cottonwood tree, the eastern cottonwood is like phasing over to this other cottonwood. Like he's noticing that the trees are changing from one, region to another. And those are I guess the sort of details that fly us by most of the time, those kinds of things.
I have noticed that, like, I go for a walk in the woods and it's like, yeah, trees. And it's like, but I think after reading this, it's almost like, wow, what kind of tree is that? And they would write like 1,000-word descriptions of everything they would find, like this specific tree. And like, they were specifically trying to be scientific about it. And so they would capture like descriptions, trying to figure out what types of families these trees would fit in. Same with the animals, like what lineage are these? They would also take samples, and so there was actually, I think it was a groundhog that they found for the first time, and like they captured the thing, and they ended up shipping it back to Thomas Jefferson from the Mandan villages, and I think it made it alive. There were a couple of crazy samples that they sent back.
Yeah, really cool.
So, all right, so we're making our way across Montana here. And a couple of things happened that I think were really interesting. One is they hit a split in the Missouri River. And again, they have no idea which split is the way we should go. And the men think that it's one direction, and Lewis and Clark think that it's the other. And they spend some time investigating. They go a certain distance up and down each river. And at the end of the day, they have to make a call. And all of the men were like, we still think it's this, but you know what? We trust your leadership. We're good to follow you wherever. I think this is a really good indicator that they were exceptional leaders. First of all, and the men they picked to take with them, and they did have discipline issues that they dealt with, but the trust that the men put in them. We also see this later when they are at the point of starvation. There was no mutiny. There was no trouble like that. It's like these men had a lot of trust in Lewis and Clark. And they would also like work hard when they needed to. So like if they were really struggling up some rapids, they would sit down and take an oar, that kind of thing, which I think is just that what people want to see of their leaders, that like they're in it with them, not just like telling them what to do.
Yeah, I this did stand out to me as like, yeah, everyone, basically it was everyone, on one side, all the men, and then them on the other side. And the men, I think it was said they were basically cheerfully followed orders, even though there was not the direction they thought. I think Lewis and Clark also, you can imagine though how thoughtful all their decisions were. Like you could tell that they thought through and reasoned through everything. So, in terms of leadership, like they're not just like, yeah, follow us, like, our way or the highway. Like, we spent a couple minutes thinking about this and picked something. They had very carefully thought things through and had reasoning behind it. So I do think the men would have known like these guys are really, really thinking things through carefully in making these decisions. And so there was a lot of trust there.
For sure. It wasn't like they were just hanging people out to dry. It was like, yeah. And I think on this specific case, the reason Lewis and Clark wanted to go a direction was because of the color of the water in the river. Is like
Right.
the sediment wouldn't be this, and they ended up being right, which probably was like got a lot of leadership capital as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, back to attention to detail there, right? Like most people be like, yeah, I even think about looking at the color of the water to see which direction the river might be coming from. So yeah, that's a cool story.
So they keep going. It's now June 1805. So they've been on the trail over a year now, and they get down to the ends of the Missouri River. So there's some great falls that they have to portage around, which means they take all their boats out of the water and they build basically wheeled carts to pull them on. Now they have gotten rid of their biggest boat at this point. They left that at the Mandan village and were more in like their canoes and smaller boats by now. But it was still a massive effort. It was over 10 miles that they had to transport their canoes, and they had literally tons of gear. Like they had
Yeah, they had
like
a lot of
blacksmithing equipment, heavy rifles, gunpowder, food, all this stuff. It was literally tons of equipment.
Yeah, this is Great Falls, Montana, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So yeah, they had 5 different waterfalls. So that they had to go around it. Yeah, and this was extremely. I remember the story. Yeah, physically taxing. Like they had to, I guess, cut down trees and try to make like improvised wheels and things like that so they could roll them around the falls.
At this point, they do try to deploy that folding boat, and unfortunately, the skins that they had available did not work. Even though the boat had been tested, like Lewis's design had been tested, it didn't work, and they had to abandon it. And apparently, that was really crushing for Lewis. He'd been looking forward to using that thing.
Yeah, he invented it, which is pretty cool. And then I think what happened, one of the big reasons it didn't work was there were no pine trees, which had the pitch needed, the tar to seal between the skins, and so they tried to make an equivalent with the kinds of trees in the area, the things they had on hand, but it just didn't work.
That's exactly right. Yep. All right, so they make it to the end of the Missouri River, and the Rocky Mountains are in view. And you can imagine seeing these for the first time. I think as tourists, we go to the mountains and we drive up for the day, and it's like, these are so beautiful. But you can imagine if your job is to cross the Rocky Mountains, that you would be looking at them completely differently. It would be like, oh, shoot, we have to cross those. Yeah, if you've ever seen the Rocky Mountains, like from Colorado Plains or whatever, it's like just this looming wall in front of you that goes on for many, many, many miles. So their dreams of taking boats all the way across the continent are completely crushed at this point.
I think one of the coolest things about this expedition is, you're out here. There's Indians out there, right? But for the most part, nobody is out there, other than these tribes. And if you've been through this area like Montana and that kind of thing, it is pretty beautiful out there. And they're also describing like some of the descriptions in the book about like the buffalo herds and the wildlife, like these massive, like as far as the eye can see, herds of buffalo. They would see like huge flocks of birds. They even described like the soil, like the being very rich in the plains. But yeah, they were definitely crushed to see the mountains. They thought it was going to be an easy passage, and these giant mountains are in their way. They're at this point, they're basically crossing over the Continental Divide as well.
So at this point, they're moving from Montana into Idaho, and they're right on the border in the Rocky Mountains there. And there were some more crazy animal stories. So Lewis specifically was out alone at one point, and he's attacked by a grizzly bear, and his gun had already been discharged because he was hunting and he had not reloaded it. So he runs into a stream or a river to try to get away from this bear. And apparently he carried a spear. It was called a festoon or a pontoon, something, but it was like a spear that he could also rest his rifle on because it was so heavy. And so he was like getting ready to make his last stand. Espontoon, thank you, that's it. And the bear ends up cowering, running away, which is like inexplicable. And so Lewis climbs out of the water, and he is charged by 3 buffalo that are trying to trample him. And so he's like on the run, he gets away from the buffalo, and he ends up sleeping, and then he wakes up and there's like a rattlesnake there, and it's a crazy like 24 hours for him. And he made some comment like, God must really be out to get me right now or something like that. But again, like, yeah, it is beautiful out there, but like, this is not camping. This is almost like Jurassic Park or something where everything's trying to kill you, basically. Yeah. So they make it up into the mountains, and they eventually run into the Shoshone Indians, and Sacagawea had been recognizing the landscape. Again, this is where she had been kidnapped / enslaved from by the other Indians. So she's like, yes, this is near where we expect to find my tribes. Like, we spend the summer over in this area. And so they keep going, and they eventually run into the Shoshones.
And it's really interesting because the chief of the Shoshones at the time turns out to be Sacagawea's brother. And so there's an emotional reunion. But this is important for a couple of reasons. They absolutely need horses now because they no longer have their boats. And good relations with the Shoshone Indians is critical for the success of the mission. Yeah, this is one of those like coincidences that's like, yeah, it's her brother. It's like, what? This is just the absolute perfect, I guess. They needed this to happen. They needed to have this relationship here for them to be able to get the horses. So there's a few points in the story where you just have those moments where it's like, if this could have gone very differently, if Sacagawea wasn't there, the expedition would have gone very differently. And this is one of those moments. That's right. So they end up getting a bunch of horses. I think it's like, actually, I don't know the number, but it was a significant number. I think it was like 60 horses or something, plus a guide. And they push on through the Bitterroot Mountains in the Rockies here. It's now September. They're starting to get snow. And apparently this is one of the hardest moments in the journey. They are running out of food. They are lost at times. They're trying to push through these mountains. And so they start eating their horses. They're eating things like candles to try to stave off the hunger. And it sounds absolutely brutal for this period here. Yeah, they were eating whatever they could find. I think there was roots and things that they were eating as well. And, the Indians had been crossing the mountains basically for hunting. I think some Indians from the west side would go to the east side to go kind of hunting in the Great Plains. And so there were known routes across the mountains, but they were extremely difficult. And I think even the Indians would almost be half starved by the time they made it across. So it's really difficult. But yeah, I don't think they know exactly what route they took, through the mountains. I think they speculate. But yeah, this is probably one of the hardest parts of the expedition is making it across. So finally, September 22nd, they emerge from the mountains. They're on the border of starvation here. They are literally starving. And they run into the Nez Perce Indians. And again, very fortuitous here moment. The Nez Perce are probably the best interaction that they have with Indians. These Indians basically save them from starvation, give them, I think it was salmon, some fish, and all of the men are incredibly sick for a couple of days because they've gone from eating nothing to eating like really nutritious food, and it made them very, very, very sick for a while, which shows how close to starvation they were. But they end up staying with the Nez Perce for a while, and the Nez Perce agree to keep their horses until the return journey. Yeah, they would definitely have starved to death if the Indians hadn't helped them at multiple points. Like they did a ton of trading at the Mandan villages, and all along the way they're trading with Indians. And then here especially, they need the food that the Indians have. So there was no game in the mountain foothills area where they were, and so they just didn't have anything to hunt. I mean, if you think about it, and if they expected to take their boats all the way across, like they kept leaving caches as they would go, because it's like, okay, we have to abandon this boat. We can't take it anymore. They would literally dig a hole and like conceal stuff in what they called a cache so they could get it on the way back. So it's like they're probably just like abandoning the stuff that they would have used because they had no idea. Apparently, they thought the Rocky Mountains would be like the Appalachians, which is like, a day or two, you can hike through them. And it's like it took them almost a solid month to get through. And yeah, again, not pretty. This was the end of Jefferson's dream too, which was the all-water passage, or even just a passage where it was easy. Like this was really the end of that when they encountered these mountains. So, but yes, they did make it to the other side. They did make it, and they found the Snake River, and they build some new canoes. They buy some canoes, and they get back in the river, and they follow the Snake River down to the Columbia River. And we're gonna fast forward a little bit here, but they're running into Indian tribes who are now more familiar with Westerners because of trading on the Pacific coast. And so these Indians are a lot more crafty, I think, when it comes to driving bargains. They're a lot harder to do deals with. And at this point, the expedition is running out of the beads, which is the currency that the Indians use. So it's getting harder and harder to buy supplies as they go. It sounds like the culture of these tribes were also a lot different. So some of the tribes, it would be like if they left something behind, the tribes would actually bring stuff to them. And it's like there was what we would call integrity. But with these tribes closer to the ocean, if you left anything at all around, it would be stolen instantly. And so again, completely different cultures among these Indians. They were not a homogeneous group by any means. But anyway, finally, they emerge on the West Coast. It is now November 1805. So again, backing up here, we left May 1804 all the way to November. So it's about a year and a half, I guess. They reached the Pacific Ocean, which, man, that must have been quite a feeling.
Yeah, they finally got sight of it. Then there's the what's the famous quote from? Oh yeah, "Ocean in view, oh the joy," I think is the quote from Clark in his journal. So, which it was actually, I think, the broad Columbia estuary that they saw first. But yeah, this was a very exciting moment for the expedition, and they basically had to set up winter quarters because they know they're not going to be able to make it back across the other side. So they had to, they were trying to find a good spot to camp and to set up winter quarters. So they ended up doing a little bit of exploring around the area to see where they could do that and pick a spot. Well, it's Fort Clatsop is the name of the place that they ended up picking and started building a fort so that they could spend the winter there.
And I guess you said a national monument or something there even today?
Yeah, there is a reconstructed Fort Clatsop. You can visit it in present day Oregon. So that would be really cool if you live near there or if you're traveling to that area. It's a replica, obviously. The original fort is long gone. But I think I've heard it's a accurate replica, so that'd be a really cool spot to check out.
Looks like it's midway between Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington, where they actually hit the coast. So they winter there again. So that is from November until March of the next year when they finally give the fort away to the Indian tribe that's there and head out, which, again, that must have been a really nice feeling. It's like, okay, we're going home after all this time out here. They start going up the Columbia River. Man, they have a thing for going upriver, I'll tell you. Which is, again, they have to portage around waterfalls and rapids and all of that. So working hard right out of the gate. They run into some Indian tribes who eat dogs, and apparently they find the dog meat a major relief after eating elk. So an interesting observation the author made was a lot of the meat they ate was very lean. So it would be like game meat. And because there was no fat on the meat, they always felt hungry, even when they were eating a lot of meat. So I think the dogs maybe helped with that. I'm not sure. I've never eaten a dog. But they actually get really into eating dogs. Apparently Clark would not eat them, but Lewis really liked the dogs. So they go back, they meet the Nez Perce again. At this point, they're hoping to go back through the Rockies, but there's still too much snow. So they try, and they actually have to turn around because the snow's too deep. So they stay with the Nez Perce and spend a couple of months there and have a great time. Apparently they do contests, like athletic contests. Lewis is treating sick Indians, again, using his medical skills, which is kind of frightening if you think about it, with what they did to people at the time. But apparently he actually helped quite a few people because he had a really good reputation as being able to heal people. So yeah, and then they go back through the Bitterroot Mountains much faster this time. They actually have Nez Perce guides to help them, and I think it was incredible. I think the author remarks how amazing it was because there's tons of snow, so these guides are able to take them through the mountains, even though there would not have been a clear trail. Which it's June and July, which is crazy that they still had that much snow. I think they said there were like in places up to 10 feet, and you imagine trying to go with horses who are heavily laden along very small trails on cliffs and whatnot. Yeah, that would be pretty intense. All right, so July 3rd, 1806, they make it to a place called Traveler's Rest. And you mentioned earlier, apparently they think they know where the campsite is for that.
Yeah, they actually have some historic evidence for the campsite there. But it's called Traveler's Rest State Park, I believe, in Montana. So you can check that out if you're over there.
It's right by Missoula, Montana, if you're looking at our map here. So at this point, they decide to split up because they want to do more exploring than they could if they all stayed together. This is perhaps one of the most dangerous decisions they make because their security has always relied on the fact that they have enough firepower the Indians don't try to overwhelm them, at least the hostile Indians. So Lewis goes north, Clark goes south on the Yellowstone River, and their plan is to meet back up on the Missouri River, basically at the edge of Montana, where it goes back to Montana to North Dakota there. So a couple of crazy things happen here. So Lewis goes north and they run into the Blackfoot Indians, and this is not a good meeting. Do you remember that story?
Yeah, well, I guess I want to say first, like they've made it this far. They have all these journals. The amount of risk goes up, right? All the stuff that they've observed. And so then at this point, they're like, yeah, let's split up the party.
And the author of the book remarks at like how risky this is. Like Lewis has like 3 people with him, and they go up the Marias River up north into the Blackfoot territory. And the Blackfoot Indians are feared by other Indian tribes. I think they had put this plan together in Fort Clatsop, and it was a pretty elaborate plan. Like they split up, like Clark goes one way, he goes one way. I think they had some other men doing some things too, and they were all going to meet back together. But it very dangerous to split people up like this. And then going into the dangerous Indian territory, it sounded like Lewis kind of became more aware of the foolishness of this when he was there, because when they went up into the Blackfeet territory, he writes in his journal about being glad that they don't run into any Indians at certain points.
Yeah, also to your point on the journals, he had remarked multiple times that like he would give his life for those journals. They had at this point thousands and thousands of pages of never known before information that they had collected, and so he was fully willing to die for those journals, which again is like, why did you split up?
The story is pretty interesting. So they meet some Blackfoot Indians. I think they were teenagers or young warriors, and so there was kind of this encounter with them. They weren't sure, like both sides were trying to figure out like who is this. They ended up coming up like shaking hands with them, and they're outnumbered, but I don't know, it's like 10 to 4, but they ended up camping and spending the night with the Indians. This is just crazy to me. Like I can't remember exactly how it came together, but one of the Indians I think was trying to steal some of the firearms. So he was like running away with one of the weapons, and they ended up getting into a fight with them. So these are some of the only Indians that they actually killed during the expedition. Like in general, they tried very hard not to. They wanted to be ambassadors from the U.S. and they didn't want to get into conflict, but this is one of those points. So they ended up killing 2 Indians. They didn't really want to, but tensions were very high, and they probably just felt very vulnerable at that point. I think they realized, if the Blackfeet Indian tribe finds us, we're done. And so they basically undertake a 100-mile horseback ride to escape back south to meet up with the rest of the party. I think they almost killed the horses. They basically rode an incredible amount of distance just trying to make sure that they weren't caught.
Yeah, so I think a bit of context there. So the Indians were stealing their rifles and horses, and the 2 things they absolutely could not survive without were rifles and horses. So I think it's like this wasn't just a random fight. It was the Indians would have basically left them to die if this had happened. And so yeah, they get into this scuffle, and it's like becomes violent. It's on both sides. It's for real. And yeah, Lewis shoots a guy. The other guy, one of his men knifes another Indian, and yeah, they do that incredible ride to make it back to the river in time, and they escape because the Blackfoot Indians are hostile after this because of this. This has a negative impact on the relations between that Indian tribe and Westerners going forward. So right before they get back together, there's one more important detail here. Now, August 11th, 1806, and they are making much better time going back. So, before it took a year and a half to get out there, the entire return journey is a little over 6 months or something like that. So it's much, much faster pace. But Lewis is out hunting. He takes a guy with him who's apparently very nearsighted. And his guy mistakes him for an elk because he's wearing like elk skin costume or outfit rather. And Lewis gets shot. He gets shot in the butt. And these balls from these rifles, these are muzzle loaders. This thing is 50 caliber, so it's like half an inch. Imagine a shooter marble. This is a big ball. Shoots, I guess you would say, like horizontally through Lewis, goes through both of his butt cheeks. And he thinks when this happens that it's an Indian attack because, again, they're running from the Blackfeet. He's like screaming, yelling, like, get the guns, get ready. He runs back to his guys on his ship. They all jump out and they form up in formation, and Lewis ends up passing out because of blood loss. And then they find out, okay, it's not the Indians. It is this guy who shot you in the butt.
I don't think he ever admitted to it.
He did not.
It's a really weird story.
It was really weird because he was like, I didn't shoot anybody, but it's like
there's nobody else that was out there. It had to be him.
Well, they recovered the ball apparently, and it was the same caliber as the rifle the dude was carrying. So it's like, it's pretty obvious, but he didn't want to get in trouble or something. So he's like, I didn't shoot anything. So yeah.
Yeah. So Lewis basically is, I guess, face down in the canoe for a while, and it takes a while for him to recover. I think is this when he quits journaling, or around the time he quits journaling?
That's possible. There's multiple times where he stops, and I think the other thing that we'll get to is he also struggled with depression a lot, and so
yeah, I mean, I'm sure this didn't help. Eventually, they meet up back with Clark's group, and it's like a major reunion. They're all like, yes, we did it. They get back to the Mandan villages in North Dakota. They're getting so close here. This is where Sacagawea and her husband exit the expedition, as well as what I found interesting. One of the men leaves. It may actually have been a bit before this, but they allow him to go, and he goes and explores the Yellowstone region.
Culture.
Yeah, and he discovers what is now Yellowstone National Park. So one of the men from the expedition becomes the discoverer of Yellowstone National Park, which is pretty cool. So yeah, they are now going downstream in the Missouri, which is a heck of a lot easier than going upstream. They make really good time. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, September 23rd, 1806. So they've been out there for well over 2 years. They make it back to St. Louis, and yeah, man, you can imagine, back to civilization.
Yeah.
Major celebrations. Everybody in St. Louis, which was like a couple thousand people at this point, or maybe less than that, turn out. They're shooting off cannons, and it's like, wow, mission accomplished. One thing we forgot to mention, they only lost one of their guys on this trip, and it was because his appendix ruptured, apparently. So it wasn't even from like a bad decision or, the boat's tipping over. All the crazy situations they went through, everybody survived except that one guy.
Yeah, that was incredible that there were not more that were lost from the entire expedition. So definitely a testament to the good leadership. I think the resilience of the people on the expedition, but in some ways the you want to just say like the luck, like some of the, again, we talk about Sacagawea and some of the other things that happened with the Indians help them. But it's really amazing. Yeah, you would have expected more. So Lewis is immediately writing to Thomas Jefferson to say like, hey, we're back safe, and I'm heading back that way, so that we can discuss the findings.
So I think we can just quickly talk about like the aftermath here, and then our takeaways.
Sounds good.
So just to abbreviate, they go to Washington D.C. They're essentially heroes. The entire expedition is granted some bonuses by Congress, so some land. They become, in a way, famous. Now, I will say, even immediately after the founding of the country, there was a two-party system, and it was very polarized. You had the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans, and the Federalists did not like the Lewis and Clark expedition because it made the other party look good, basically. So right out of the gate, you had that kind of nonsense going on, but like, yeah, nothing new under the sun, right? But they get their journals back. They're talking to Thomas Jefferson, and the expectation is they're going to publish these journals with all these incredible findings. But for whatever reason, they do not do so right away.
Yeah, this is you're finishing the book here, and this is just the crazy part where, Jefferson's pressing Lewis. He's like, you need to publish these things. And they even had, some of the privates that had written were trying to publish their own journals. And so there was actually some competition here to see who could get it first. But Lewis was like, yeah, I need to do a really good job. So he was looking into like hiring people that could analyze all those scientific, calculations and observations for position. People that could, like, I think a guy that was familiar with, plants and animals and things like that. Scientists that could help not clean up, but organize that information. People that could help, I guess, lay out the maps and the sketches and things like that. There's a tremendous amount of prep needed to publish something. But he doesn't even get an editor. You need a general editor to pull this together, and he doesn't do that. And so, Jefferson is pressing him to get it ready, and he's not getting the journals ready.
So a couple of years later, a couple of years go by, and Lewis really spirals. It sounds to me like he went crazy. There may have been some other things going on, so like health issues, suspected drinking issues, perhaps. So, he did this incredible job on the expedition. He crashes and burns when he gets back. Clark does better. He ends up having a successful life, is well respected. But yeah, Lewis ends up dying. It's very possible he committed suicide. There are some theories that he was murdered, but it seems very likely it was suicide before the journals were finished. And so Clark ends up taking them up and finishing them. But it's after now the War of 1812, and a lot of folks have moved on. It's been multiple years.
Yeah, it's not headlines anymore.
And so for like 100 years, the Lewis and Clark expedition is almost forgotten. Like, it's not completely forgotten, but it's not famous. And then eventually somebody gets the journals and does a complete rewrite of them, publishes them, and Lewis and Clark become what we know today, one of the most famous, successful expeditions. But because their journals were delayed, a lot of their discoveries, they had named hundreds of animals and plants. those names were lost. Other people discovered those things and renamed them. So yeah, the legacy unfortunately ends a bit in tragedy here, where they did really well and then they just kind of didn't execute when they got back. Just reading the book, it sounds like Lewis got distracted when he got back. So there was a lot of like, oh, we're going to have this new trade empire. And he was made like, was it the territory governor?
That's right.
So he was, kind of trying to look, it sounded kind of self-interested. He went in a self-interested direction to try to, kind of get in on the action a little bit. So he was kind of, getting into that and not focusing on the journal publication. And so it did seem like, yeah, that was part of it and then I always kind of wondered if, you mentioned depression. There was probably an incredible sense of mission during that. Now it was, tremendous amount of, there's some physical suffering and all of that, but just to have that driving purpose for those 2 years, you wonder what it was like to come off of that and to kind of try to re-enter regular life, if you want to call it that. That sounds like he just didn't do that very well.
Yeah.
He even, I remember reading as well that he was looking for like a love interest, someone to get married to, and he was unable to find someone, whereas Clark did. So I think, yeah, the wheel started to come off for him, it seemed like.
So yeah, I think the ultimate outcome here is this expedition opened the West. They now had maps. They had the expectation to go trade with the Indians. Now, of course, all of their peace expedition kind of fell apart. The Indians were all at war immediately with each other. But this was the beginning of Western expansion, which is a major portion of U.S. history. So yeah, again, incredible journey here, incredible expedition, very successful, and ultimately led to the major developments in the United States, which is pretty cool. Now that we've completed the journey, we kind of have a sense for this story. It'd be interesting just to take a few minutes and talk like, what does it mean for us today? What can we do with this information?
Yeah, I think we picked this story because it is an inspiring story for us today, and so we can dig into that. It's just really interesting to think about the people that went on this expedition, like what kinds of skill and capability was required to do this. And I think it's inspiring if you look at Lewis and Clark, kind of like you look at Teddy Roosevelt. It's like this, Lewis specifically was very well educated. He also had just the, survival skills to go out in the wilderness like that, to make scientific observations. And, it's easy, I guess, today for us to be very reliant on the technology that we have. Like there's no reason to cite the stars. Like you can just pull your phone out and look at where you are. You can Google all kinds of information. So we have a lot of access to information. But in some ways, it does feel like unassisted without this, we are less, on average, maybe capable at that time. So I think that was inspiring to me, was to say, like, how can we rely less on kind of these crutches that we have today and make ourselves more capable just through learning and experience.
We have access to, as you said, so much information. We can be anywhere in the country within a few hours. Like we could go to the top of the Rockies if we wanted today. But even if we were to do that, it feels like we're almost numb to what we see. It's like, oh, there's mountains and there's trees. And it's like we're so exposed to so much stuff and so much information that we almost don't value it anymore, like the knowledge. And so when you see like the documentation that Lewis and Clark were taking and like observing everything around them, and it's like, oh, you're on this river, and it's like, oh, there's the tributaries, and we're mapping it, and we're finding, it's like and I think Thomas Jefferson had this. It's almost like a curiosity where it's like wanting to learn and experience and know. I think we have access to knowledge. I'm not sure that we have the same, like we're not using it the same way.
Yeah, I think, when we're talking about like raising kids, and you want to train people to, I guess, be curious minds, to enjoy learning and discovering things. And then it's this element of being able to see, right? So if you think about details, like all the observations they did, like they had to train themselves to see things that we maybe like today don't see when we're talking about the trees and the leaves and things like that. You don't even know what kinds of, animals and plants are around you, or like observing the weather or any of those sorts of outdoor things, like being able to not just appreciate them, to be able to actually like see them and to observe them and to kind of sharpen your observational skill. I think that's something that we can still do today.
The other thing is the grit that these people had to have. So obviously everything was harder back then. They didn't have air conditioning. That would be pretty hard.
But these men specifically could have just stayed on their plantations. They were wealthy. They didn't need to do this, but they chose to go out and they chose to do hard things for the sake of knowledge, for the sake of advancing their own country. Uh, but they also had a level of grit and to an extreme. They were pushing to the point of starvation. Obviously, we don't want to do that, but I do think that that's something that we should perhaps be emulating for our kids and helping our kids get is like these days we are so surrounded by what makes us comfortable. It's like we can be on screens entertained 24/7, we can be in comfortable air conditioned houses. And I think that's part of the reason we miss like what's in the world around us. You almost have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And they talk about even in the book like the mosquitoes that they dealt with and the heat that they were dealing with and the hunger. And it's like, this was not easy. And I'm not saying that we need to go out and starve ourselves to death, but I do think a willingness to embrace hardship, is valuable.
Yeah, I think so. It's, being tougher, being more resilient, not in like seeking harm way. We're not saying that, but I think that is a good quality to build kind of resilience against that. And then I think, just being, I guess, ready for, ready to undertake that. Some of the challenges that we might face today, we're not going to cross a continent and like risk death. Like this was a very special situation and they knew that this was making history. But just, I think you can ask yourself the question, like, if you've been given the opportunity to go on the expedition, like, would you do it? And I think obviously the men knew that this was a historic opportunity, but at the same time, there's a very real risk of like, dying out there. No one knows what's out there. And so in a much smaller way, like you could ask yourself, like, would I be able to undertake the risk? And even at that point, probably didn't make pragmatic sense to do this, right? You can just like, yeah, it's just, too much risk. I want to kind of stick with what I know and kind of not go outside my comfort zone. But like in a much smaller way today, I think you can draw inspiration from this and say, you are willing to take calculated risk. You are willing to get us out of your comfort zone and do hard things, like you said.
That's right. And I think that ultimately comes back to like, what is the purpose of our lives? Is it to be comfortable and entertained, or is it to accomplish? Is it to strive, to improve, to, learn things and make a difference in the world? And I think for these men, they were doing what they thought would make a difference for their country. It was a very patriotic reason that motivated them to take this risk. I think that is one reason to do things. Another reason would be spiritual. It's like, what are we doing in this life from a spiritual perspective that has meaning? So it's really just coming back to asking the question, what are we doing today? Are we just coasting? Are we accepting the comfort of the technology that we have? Or are we still using that to go out and push ourselves to accomplish things? And I think that is ultimately what you can learn from this story is there is a lot that you can do in this life that perhaps we're not even aware of because we don't think that way anymore.
Yeah, so this story is something you can show to your kids and just, as I think inspiration to them as well. It's something they can look at kind of this expedition, this journey. And I think as parents, you're asking the question, like, what role models from history and situations and circumstances are you putting in front of kids? And putting this great story of like exploration, challenge, and risk, that's a great thing that they can benefit from if you put that in front of them.
Yeah, and I think the last thing that I'll touch on there is just as we raise our kids, are we insulating them so much from risk and danger that it's essentially stunting their growth? And that kind of goes back to the early stories of whether it's Teddy Roosevelt or Lewis, and they're out hunting from an early age. They're out doing these hard things. I think that's very different than a lot of the ways that we parent as a culture these days, where it's like, oh, we don't even build playgrounds unless they've been certified 3 different ways on safety that nobody's possibly ever going to get hurt. And I think obviously we don't want our kids to get hurt, but we also, I think, need to allow them to explore and learn their own capabilities, which requires a certain degree of danger and risk. Which obviously needs to be appropriate for their age. But I just think that's kind of a final thing is like, if we want our kids to be able to do great things, they have to be capable. And the only way to be capable is to push yourself. And so we need to give them the freedom to do that.
We're definitely in a time where we're much more safety conscious, and which is not a bad thing. But I think the flip side of that is that some of these
these things, like these qualities that you want to raise in your kids, can inadvertently be stifled. So making sure that they have the opportunity to take on challenges and to build that capability.
Well, I think that pretty much wraps us up for today. So again, if you are interested, take a look at the book Undaunted Courage. Gives all of the details on this expedition. There's a lot of other resources out there, documentaries and what have you, if you want a more media-friendly format. But yeah, definitely take a look at this. And as we mentioned, we're going to be doing this podcast series going on. So stay tuned for episode 3. We've had a few conversations on what that might be, but hopefully we'll be coming soon here.
Yep, stay tuned. We're excited, but thanks for joining us today.
All right, get out there and do some mighty things.